Now, despite a rocky start, the renewed truce between Israel and Palestine continues to hold. Both sides agreed to extend the truce by 5 more days, lending an air of cautious optimism for progress with the Cairo peace talks. The Palestinian delegation has now left Cairo to consult leader Mahmoud Abbas. Nabila Ramdani, a journalist and Middle East expert, joins me now. And Nabila, a truce extension, a window for further negotiation. Are there reasons to be hopeful that they can move towards some sort of durable solution?
Well, I think really the first thing to say is that the number one priority in all of these discussions is that they must focus on saving lives. And what tends to happen is that people tend to get so bogged down into the minutiae, if you like, of demands and strategic details that they forget that it's about men, women and children being killed and very often indiscriminately day in, day out. There's a war going on between Israel and Hamas, and that's why all of the Israeli casualties are soldiers, members of the Israeli Defense Force, except for 3 civilians. 2 of them died of shock. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, it's almost all the complete opposite. The vast majority, in fact, more than 85% of the casualties are innocent civilians. So from the Palestinian perspective, the families and friends of the 2,000 and odd Palestinians, including more than 450 children who were killed by the Israeli military, they will not be in the least bit interested in military victory. They would be interested in their survival and escaping further massacres, deliberate massacres of this sort. In which case, any discussion on peace deals must start from this position, and something has to be done to stop indiscriminate infanticide and more generally the killing of civilians. And if the Israelis can accept this, then we would be a lot further along the road towards hammering out a permanent solution.
And of course, Nabila, something has to be done as well to stop Hamas rockets being fired into Israel. What hopes have you for these talks in Cairo? What is your expectation?
The 2 sides are putting demands. The Hamas and indeed the Palestinian Authority are essentially asking for the lifting of the inhumane 8-year blockade on Gaza and to be able to open a seaport and to expand the fishing areas, the offshore fishing areas, so that fishermen can, go about and get some food essentially and trade with the outside world.
And in return, what will be offered?
And in return, the Israelis are insisting on the demilitarization of Hamas, presenting it as a threat to Israel. But I must insist that it is a display of absolute false logic. Hamas represents next to no military capability, has next to no military capability. Its rockets are obsolete and have next to no effect on the security of Israel. Yes, nobody condones the firing of obsolete rockets, but they need to be dealt with in a manner that reflects the danger that they actually represent. And I've just said it, 1 Israeli civilian has died from a rocket. So they do not represent much danger. And that's, what we're hearing from the Israelis is that the Palestinian people, they're asking effectively, the Palestinian people is the only people on earth asked to guarantee the security of its occupier. And that's fundamentally flawed.
But I suppose, Nabila, from the Israeli side, they will say, we're looking for an acknowledgement of our right to exist.
But
but you must go on from there to try and hammer out some form of a deal that can deliver peace for all of the people you talk about within Gaza who have been through the last 4 weeks of bombardment.
But of course, nobody is denying Israel's the right to exist. And in fact, Israel is the only state that exists in that area. The Palestinian state doesn't exist. And I think we shouldn't be, misled into thinking that these are rounds of violence that happen on a recurrent basis between 2 neighbors. They are not neighbors. One is an occupying force, one is an occupying nation, and it regularly invades the people they occupy. These are not, bad relationships or between 2 neighbors who, from time to time, fire rockets or missiles at each other. One is a state that exists and regularly invades and bomb its occupiers into submission.
There are enormous questions to be hammered out. It has been tried and it has failed on many occasions. To focus on Cairo at the moment, though, they're not addressing the big questions. They're starting perhaps with the smaller issues that perhaps can be resolved. What are those issues?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think the smaller issues reflect how, further along the road the two sides can get. And they have to do with, having the two peoples live happily and content. And that's precisely why the Gaza Strip, which has been blockaded for 8 years, with all sorts of restrictions, it's effectively controlled by Israel. The airspace is controlled, the land borders, the sea borders are controlled by Israel. The amount of calories per person are minutely regulated by Israel that are allowed to get into the Gaza Strip. Medical supplies are not allowed in. Construction material is not allowed in. And all this is being, very ferociously regulated by Israel. And what the people of the Gaza Strip are asking, along with human rights organizations across the world, is that Israel has to stop inflicting misery upon the Palestinians who live in Gaza, and they cannot go on punishing the entire population of Gaza, because this will never, ever achieve a long-lasting peace.
Would you describe these talks as truce talks to a longer-term cessation, or would you describe them as truce talks to perhaps peace negotiations?
I think these are important talks, even if they look very difficult. I think it's perhaps the first time since we've seen such an outrage amongst the international community at the mass murder of innocent civilians, and indeed an infanticide, that there's an awful lot of pressure put on Israel from all sides, from human rights organizations to, public opinions around the world, putting pressure on their own governments, including in the US and in the UK. We've seen how it led to the resignation of a cabinet minister, that, there's a review going on in the British Parliament about regulating, the trade deal between the UK and indeed Israel.
And what do you think of Egypt, given its current attitude, al-Sisi's attitude to Hamas, the role of Egypt here in being the honest broker in these talks?
Well, fundamentally, Egypt is not an honest broker, for the very simple reason that it is a military dictatorship, and as such, is not in a position of authority to discuss, any peace deals. And let's not forget that Egypt is also, being blamed for stifling, the Palestinians who live in Gaza. Effectively, people who live in Gaza are under, a dual embargo, a dual blockade, if you like, both from Israel and indeed Egypt, because Egypt has a border with Gaza. The Rafah crossing is shut, and the Egyptian government is not allowing.
So that's all a negative, Nabila.
That's all very negative. But this latest round of violence represents such a watershed in terms of the outrage it represented, that I think it will not end with a status quo, as is usually the case. There will have to be more concessions.
Nabila Ramdani, journalist and Middle East expert, thank you.